The title today is Holy Spaces Part 10. And the subtitle is, wait a minute, do y'all know what gadding about means? Am I in that part of the country where it still makes sense? You know what gadding around? Okay. Gadding outside the Holy Land is the title. And remember, we taught a lesson on the rebellion of Korah. And I told you that the rebellion of Korah was not about rebellion. It wasn't to teach you how to be a good rebel, but it was to teach us how to be good leaders. The focus really was more positive maybe than we've heard. Today the lesson, we're continuing in our book of war, and today the lesson is also a lesson of leadership. It's a lesson of lay leadership. Every one of you is a leader in your own right. By virtue of the fact that you're occupying a seat in this congregation, you are a leader according to the examples that have gone before us. Now, Numbers 22 presents an excellent lesson to us about the holy spaces. And it teaches what Yeshua taught, that it's hard, but it's not impossible for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. A lot of people would want to ask, just by reading, if we read chapter 32, they would ask, did God and Reuven sin by asking to stay on the other side of the Jordan? We're not going to answer that question. That's not the question. The real question is, what are we supposed to learn by the fact that they asked to stay on the other side of the Jordan from the other tribes? What are we supposed to learn from their desire to separate from their brothers? I think in the summation, what we have to decide is whether we're going to hold ourselves accountable for our own gadding about outside of the holy spaces. We have to discern our own priorities and our own faith. So we have to ask, as Maxine did in her message, are we relying on luck? Are we relying on windows of opportunity? Did you hear in their voices, oh, we have cattle and this is cattle country. Give us this. It's perfect. And we've said that before. This would be perfect. If I could have this, it would be just what I need. Are we relying on those windows of personal opportunity, or are we relying on the power of God's strength in order to achieve the goal? Are we relying on His unwavering vision to achieve our goals? Now, because we're dealing with a tribe named God, we might have some confusion here. So I'm going to try to avoid using God to refer to God. Instead, maybe I'll say Hashem or Adonai or something, so that you'll know that I'm talking about the tribe of God as opposed to the one God. I hope I can remember. The scripture's clear, though. If we're relying on windows of opportunity, personal opportunity, windows of luck, or so forth, then we're relying on something that is vanity. But if we're relying on His vision and upon His strength, then that's victory. That is victory to us in a time of war. One is the nature of the rich man, and one is the nature of the poor man. And so you're thinking, okay, rich, poor, which one are you talking about? Because Yeshua says, if you're poor, you're rich, and if you're rich, you're poor. Exactly. It's going to trade places on you. Because a rich man in this kingdom of the world is not truly independent, even though that's what he most desires, is to have more money so that he can be more independent and not have to rely on other people, and least to fall upon the Father in heaven. He has the power of his own kingdom. As time progresses, and as he grows older, what he finds out that it's very evident that he is not the rich man at all. He's nothing more than a hired servant, because he has become a slave to that kingdom that he has built. A poor man, though, is rich in the kingdom. And what makes him poor is that he understands the poverty of his own spirit. A poor man can't snap his fingers and some servant bring in a spotless, unblemished lamb for a sacrifice. A poor man has a very small flock. And every lamb in that little flock is precious to him because he can't afford very much. If he were to sin and have to bring a lamb, would his family go without something to eat? He understands the poverty of his spirit because he can't afford his own sacrifice. And that's why Yeshua says it's so much easier if you're poor in this world to accept what I am doing for you because you're not self-sufficient like a rich man. A poor man, you know you don't have it. You don't have it to spare. And you know something will go wanting should you mess up and sin. And you have to take that sacrifice, and you are going to deprive your wife and your little ones if you have to spare a lamb from your very small flock. Maybe, like the story that was told to King David, maybe it was this man's only lamb. If you were poor, you understood that. And you understood the consequence of your sin. It had huge repercussions. And so therefore, a poor man understands the sacrifice that Yeshua made for us. We can't afford him. But he had the authority, and he laid down that sacrificial life for us. We didn't have many cattle with which to pay our vows and our sacrifices, but he became that for us. But like God and like Reuven, a rich man is likely to be found wanting to build up his own kingdom, his own family and possessions, just when the congregation of Israel needs him the most. Perhaps it's time that we become soldiers for one another. Perhaps it's time that Israel realize that there is a generation sometimes that's called to leave their families behind, protected for sure, in a safe place and secure, but a soldier like God is called to leave his sheep and his little ones behind in order to make war, in order to possess those holy spaces with the congregation of Israel. I want you to remember, that was kind of a powerful little camel metaphor that was in the prophets, but in Hebrew the word camel is gamal, or gimel, which is the Hebrew letter gimel. It's the same symbol, and gimel, or gamal, the camel, represents the rich man. And in those times, a camel caravan would carry everything you had. You invested, if you were a merchant or an investor, you invested everything you could, and these goods were loaded on a camel, and they traveled to far cities in order to earn you a profit and trade. So that was your entire fortune and your future security loaded onto that camel. But Yeshua says the entrance to the kingdom is very small. It's like a camel going through the eye of a needle. And you're thinking, but everything I own, my whole future, my retirement, my TSP account, my IRA, everything is loaded on this camel. And you're saying I can't get through that little entrance to the kingdom if I won't be willing to unload these things off of my camel? Well, the good news is eventually they get loaded back on for you once you reach the other side. But it's a different sort of riches. You learn something by unloading that camel, by putting your faith in the Father as opposed to what's loaded on that camel's back. There was a gate called the Eye of the Needle in Jerusalem. And it said that as the camels approached this gate that they would have to be unloaded, and they would have to stoop down in order to lead these camels through the gate before they could pack them back up again. So you can see what you own may indeed prevent you from realizing the reward that's waiting for you. What if you weren't willing to unpack that camel? You would never get through the gate, would you? Sometimes when we're too rich in our own family and our own possessions, it's hard for us to press through into the kingdom. It's very, very small. And the entrance is designed to make you stoop down, to bow down in humility, and to unpack the things that you've always put faith in. And to put faith in God Abba himself, to take you through that entrance. And are we willing to unload our camels today? Now let's talk about the story of God, the tribe God. It's an interesting name, and it's very confusing because it's come to us as meaning the Creator, but it's actually the tribe God. And it can have several different meanings. It can mean special forces, like troops, mercenary troops. And in a sense, God was a mercenary troop because that was how they earned their portion. They had to go to war in order to get what they asked for. So they did, in a sense, become mercenaries. Their price was the price of war. They were soldiers of fortune. And that's interesting because God can also mean luck or fortune. And that's what we're talking about. Do we depend on luck or fortune? Every word has two meanings, negative or positive. God could depend on their good fortune. We found this wonderful place. Or they could depend upon their Father in heaven. The luck or fortune actually played a part in idol worship. They would have forms of idol worship in those times that were dedicated to God, a God of luck and fortune. Some people still depend upon a God of luck, though now they want her to be a lady instead of a troop. But the root of God has to do with cutting or stinging. You've heard of a gadfly? Okay, that's what they're doing. They're stinging. It can mean cutting or stinging. And that's where you get the idea of advanced troops or shock troops, because these troops, they would move out in front, they would move fast, they would sting the enemy, they would soften them up, and then the larger army could move in and get the full victory. God is also associated with cutting oneself in pagan worship. I see a lot of people cutting themselves today in order to put little designs on themselves. The most interesting aspect of God, though, is not his negative qualities of being associated with idolatry or luck or whatever. The most holy aspect of his name has to do with something we've already covered in the holy spaces, and that is the Gader. You remember what the Gader was? The wall, the low stone wall. It was a protective wall which we associated with the Torah. It's a protective enclosure. Remember, it was built around the vineyard, Israel, in order to protect it. And so it enclosed a holy land and a holy space. And I want to read to you again Ezra 9 from that lesson. It says, "But now for a brief moment, grace has been shown from the Lord our God to leave us an escaped remnant and to give us a peg in his holy place, that our God may enlighten our eyes and grant us a little reviving in our bondage. For we are slaves. Yet in our bondage our God has not forsaken us, but has extended loving kindness to us in the sight of the kings of Persia, to give us reviving, to raise up the house of our God, to restore its ruins, and to give us a wall in Judah and Jerusalem." That wall there is the Gader. It is the heap of protective stones that we equate with the Torah, that protective boundary around Israel. In our generation, we must also become as God. We must begin to build up the breaches in that wall where the stones of the Torah have come loose in our community. It's our responsibility to begin to pick up those stones of the Torah and put them back in the breach, and to stand right there in that breach like a good shepherd. Today, however, the problem with God is that he wants only to build the Gader for his own family and his own possessions. And that's a problem because he has lost a vision that Moshe had to remind him of, that this is a congregational movement. This is the camp of Israel. He did not call you to protect only your own family and your own goods. He called you to be a part of congregational unity and to move the camp forward. And while family and income are important, you can't neglect either one of those. And they should be hedged about with the protective wall of the Torah. To neglect the congregation. Now listen to what I'm saying, because I'm not saying it lightly. To neglect the congregation is sin. Listen to the scripture. "For if you turn away from following him, He will once again leave them in the wilderness, and you will destroy all these people. If Gad and Reuben did not go up with the congregation to the Holy Land, if they stayed behind with their wives and their little ones and their sheep, it says, you will destroy these people. He didn't say they will succeed without you. They will just move on without you because you dropped out. He said, no. He will once again leave them in the wilderness. What happened to Israel depended on these two tribes and Manasseh, the half-tribe. So you are not alone in this congregation. How you behave with the camp determines how he treats the rest of the camp. Is it possible that our families and our possessions could cause us to destroy Hashem's people? These are good things. Family is ordained of heaven, right? Instituted. Possessions. He knows that we need a source of income. We have to eat. We have to feed our wives and our little ones. He ordained these things from heaven, and He ordained them in His Torah. How can they then become a destruction? How can things that are good, how can things that are Torah become destruction also to the congregation of believers? It boils down to priorities. It's where you put these things. If we were to read this text carefully in Hebrew, we would see something that we've probably missed in English. If you read carefully, even in English, you're going to notice that when they first approach, Gad and Reuben did not offer to continue into that Holy Land. They were ready to stop short and say, this is it, we've arrived, and sit down. People, we can't ever say we've arrived, this is it, and sit down. We have to keep moving. If the camp is moving, we're moving with them. We can't be spying out the favorable places for ourselves on the journey. Their first approach is simply asking to be left behind to build the gadirah, the sheepfolds, for their flocks, it's called cattle. In a lot of the English versions it'll say cattle. When they're saying cattle in Hebrew, that is not cows and bulls, bovines. The cattle in that context is specifically referring to sheep and goats. So that's why I keep saying sheepfolds. They want to be left behind to build folds for their goats and for their sheep. And they want to build cities for their families. And Moshe rebukes them strongly. I mean, talk about discipline. He lets them have it. He unloads on them and says, what do you mean? How dare you discourage this people by trying to drop out? You were called to this congregation, and now you want to drop out because you found something that looks a little better, and you don't want to fight the war with the rest of the assembly. They draw away, and you know this when you read it in Hebrew because you can see them regrouping. Because it says, then, when you read it in Hebrew, then they drew near to him. That means they're coming back. Okay, we've got this. Okay, let's rephrase this. Then they drew near to him. On the second approach, they offer their services as the shock troops. They offer to continue in advance of the other armies of Israel and to leave their secured possessions and their families behind. And in this, Moshe accepts that they have corrected their priorities. That is when it's accepted, and that is when he says, this can be your possession. If you will do this thing, if you will go in front so as not to discourage the camp, then this thing that you desire, then it will be yours. So even if this land of Yazer was the promised holy space for these 2.5 tribes, their motive and their priority was wrong going into it. They put their personal inheritance above the unity of Israel. When the congregation was waging war, they would have been home with their sheep and their families. What is this bleating of sheep in my ears? This, Moshe says, will discourage the congregation. And some of you have been in congregations where this has happened. There's been a split. Somebody saw something that looked a little better over here. They took part of the congregation with them, and the people that were left in utter discouragement. Are we really the people of God? Abba. We can see just how wrong their motive is when we contrast the way that the Gadites frame their request and how Moshe corrects it for them. They're making two mistakes here. Number one, their priorities, and number two, their faith. First is their priorities. If you were to read verse 16 carefully, you're going to see that at first they did intend to build sheepfolds for their flocks and then cities for their families. Where were their priorities? In their money. Sheep were money back then. Their career, their job, their business. That came first. Let us work on our income here, and then we'll make our families secure. That's what we're going to do, Moshe. And Moshe says, no, you're not. That's not it. But before we judge them too harshly, has anything changed? Do you still know men that put their income, their career, their job, their whatever it is that makes them feel good ahead of their relationship with their families? It's one thing to support your family. It's another thing to abandon them in order to acquire more things. This is not Torah. They might acquire all the possessions in the world and say that they're doing it for their kids, but if their kids never see them, when it's all said and done, they will find themselves in poverty of relationship with their wives and their children. They will indeed be poor and find out that all this time they were not the rich men, they were the slaves. That they put the relationship with their wives and children underneath acquiring more goods. So let's not judge the Gadites too harshly in this instant. It's still happening. We understand how the rich of the world become the poor at the end. Richness consists of relationships. If you have relationships of kindness, of mercy, of love, friendship, that is what makes you rich. It's not the number of figures that you have in your bank account. Acknowledging the oneness of Adonai and his congregation is understanding what it means to have a little flock. Were the Gadites and the Reubenites, were they true shepherds? Say they're shepherds, right? We're shepherds and we need this land for our cattle. But were they true shepherds of the sheep? When Moshe replies to them, he corrects their priorities. He says, build your cities for your little ones, and then build folds for your sheep. Make sure that your relationship with your family is secure. And then if you want to acquire excessive goods, go after it. But make sure those relationships are secure first. Before you go gadding about, make sure you understand where your true source of income is. This is Torah. This isn't me. However, in this generation that we're reading about, the camp is at war. It's an unusual situation. The camp is not always at war, but sometimes it is. And this is a key generation that's about to press into an inheritance. So the rules are sometimes a little bit different for those generations. Moshe here is making an incredible demand, and one we don't necessarily like to hear. Especially in this part of the country, family is very strong. I've lived in places in large cities where people move all the time, and that family tie is not so strong. And this part of the country, it's very much family oriented, and this is going to sound not so good in a place like this. Moshe is demanding that 2.5 tribes leave their families behind in order to make war for the congregation of Israel. And I think this is where our military today diverges from Israel's army and even from our own armies of history. In the past, when Americans went to war, they went to protect their families. They went for God and country. There was something called patriotism. They wanted to defend their families from both physical attack and ideological attacks from enemies. In fact, I was watching the History Channel yesterday, and the World War veteran who was on the bomber on the last bombing run over Japan, the one that was the last one of the World War II. I said, why did you do that? Why? You know, you had to have known when you were in the air and you were encountering all the flak that was put up, and then you nearly ran out of fuel and all these things happened to you. What was going through your mind? Were you sorry that, you know, you had just found out that the war's over and the Japanese surrendered and you're about to crash over Iwo Jima and you were almost there? Would you have been sorry that you gave your life when the war was already over at that time? You just hadn't had the good luck to make it down? And he said, no. We were fighting so that our children could live in a free country. We were fighting for our children so that they could live in a free country. There wasn't an I in his statement. That's patriotism. That is what Moshe is urging the Gadites and the Reuvenites to do, to have a sense of patriotism. What is the mission? What do you believe in? What's worth dying for? What is worth leaving your family behind for? Today, I don't think we recruit young men and women that way. I've been watching the commercials, the military commercials, to see if I could find some shred of what that blessed old man said about what he did. If I could hear some we or our in those advertisements, and not one time in all the commercials I've listened to over the last couple of months have I heard the recruiting commercials say, we or our. I hear, be all you can be. Learn a trade. You can get money for college. People, these are mercenaries if that's the only reason they're going. What did Yeshua say about a mercenary? He said, in the evil day when a true enemy comes, a shepherd will stand with the flock. But in that day, when you are meeting at least an equal or superior enemy, what will a hireling do? If he's in it for the money, don't depend on him. He's going to run away. But that's how we're recruiting young people. Just do it for what's in it for you. Whatever happened to do it for your country, do it for your children. Now, fortunately, when I hear some of the news interviews, and they interview some of these young men who are serving overseas, you do hear that sense of patriotism is still there. They are still doing it for their families. They are still doing it for their country. And bless them for that. But you know what? They can't thank the recruiters for that sense of patriotism. It came from inside of them. It didn't come from a recruiter, because all a recruiter told them was what they could get out of it. I don't know what's going to happen if we have this sort of military, if they ever meet an army that is equal to them in power. You know, for the last few decades, we've been meeting enemies that they're rusted out. Third world countries. We're very superior in technology in every way. What will happen when they meet an equal enemy? Will they stand for the flock? Or will they run away like a hireling? If they love their country, they will stand and fight. Priorities are very important. What are you in it for? The Gadites' second mistake was their faith. In their offer to go before Israel as shock troops, the Gadites failed to acknowledge the source of Israel's military power. They are talking as though they could do this all on their own. Listen to what they say. But we ourselves will go ready armed before the children of Israel until we have brought them home to their place. Now, did they really think that they could do it? We ourselves until we have brought them. Once again, Moshe very patiently corrects them. I want you to count how many times in his statement Moshe says before the Lord. Then Moshe said to them, if you do this thing, if you arm yourselves before the Lord for the war, and all your armed men cross over the Jordan before the Lord, until he has driven out his enemies from before him, and the land is subdued before the Lord, then afterward you may return and be blameless before the Lord and before Israel, and this land shall be your possession before the Lord. See how he corrected their faith? They thought, he needs us, we're going to do it for him. They got Gad and Reuben, they got nothing to worry about, we're going to bring them right in. Moshe says, before the Lord, 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 and Israel. You're not walking alone. You're not doing it in your own strength. You are not fighting in your own power and your strength. You are fighting before the Lord. Our battles are fought in faith toward Adonai, and it is only then that we are blameless. Had they gone up in that attitude, they would have still been in sin. And they would have fallen first, I imagine. Your lack of faith and your wrong priorities not only incur blame with the Father above, but it also incurs blame with the community of faith. Did you hear that? Once he put in there, before the Lord and before Israel. If you're trying to do things in your own strength, if you're running out ahead and saying, I can do it, I can do it, I can do it, I can do it, instead of saying, I can do it before the Lord, I can do it before the Lord, I can do it before the Lord, then you are not only incurring blame before your Father, you're incurring blame before your community, before your congregation. And what Moshe says about this, your lack of faith and your wrong priorities, he says, but if you will not do so, if you will not have faith, and if you will not correct your priorities, behold, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. We're not talking about a simple error. We're talking about a sin that's going to find you out. It's not what you do for this community in faith that puts blame on you. That will not bring blame to your life if you do something for this community in faith, toward, before Adonai. It's what you do not do for this community that incurs blame and that incurs sin before the community and before Adonai. When there is a battle to fight, Adonai may ask you to sacrifice some family things in order to encourage and to lead his army. What would you have said had you been the one that said, let me go bury my father? And Yeshua said to you, not to anyone else, to you. If he had said to you, not the person, let the dead bury the dead, but you follow me. What would you have done? It's a mitzvah to respect your mother and father, right? But what if Yeshua says, in a great moment of time, the Lord of Lords was standing before this man, saying, let the dead bury the dead, but you, now is the time. Come follow me. There's 2.5 tribes poised, standing on the edge of holiness. By their obedience, they can create a holy land even on the other side of the Jordan. They can do it through faith, correct priorities, and obedience, a willingness to fight. You see, it goes back to what we said before. Obedience creates holy spaces, no matter where you are. They have this choice. And their choice is this: will we be true shepherds of the true sheep? Or will we be hirelings looking after our own flocks and herds, building our own cities, putting our personal families, our personal belongings ahead of the vision that Adonai has for this holy people and this holy time? All history is hinging on what we do right now. That is their choice. Will they fight before Adonai in the power of His strength so that the entire community can remain guiltless and can be brought out of a wilderness of uncleanness? And so we have a choice as well today. Are we going to go gadding about in separation from Israel? Or are we going to unite with the vision that the Father has for one family and one flock? It's a greater family and a greater flock. See, most of us have always been taught that the family is the foundation for the congregation, right? You can't have the congregation without the foundation of family. And unfortunately, way too many people still believe that their income, their possessions, come before their congregation. That's been the predominant practice. But this is not a belief based on Torah. Not the one we read today. In time of war, He might ask you to do some remarkable things. We can take good commandments and wrestle them out of balance and put them into the wrong context. Hashem wants your family and your income to be secure. But if you are a member of the Commonwealth of Israel, according to Ephesians 2, then it is the well-being of the congregation that you must see to. It is their battles, their conflicts that you are called to be a leader in. It's everyone is called to be a leader. If you don't think this is a key generation that's being called upon to do unusual things and fight unusual battles, you've been asleep since 1947.
Amen.
It's time to wake up, Rip Van Winkle. Something remarkable is happening. If you don't think Israel is at war, I don't know where you are. This is a battle. This is a conflict. And are you a shepherd of this flock? Or are you a hireling? Are you here to satisfy your own needs and your own desires and your own wants and your own lacks? Or do you come in here every Shabbat in order to satisfy the needs of the greater flock? Are you here before the Lord and in the power of His strength? Remember, Deborah was a judge over Israel. And she was a great judge. Everybody went up to her to hear her judgments. But before she was merited 40 years of peace in the land, she was called to war. She had to go up to war in order to bring peace to the congregation of Israel. And you also are going to be asked to make some decisions. You are also a judge. You will be. How will you judge angels if you're not willing to go up to war when it's time to go? You see, at that time, the tribe of Gad, they would not go up to war with Deborah. They stayed in their sheepfolds, listening to the flute. Just turn the music up a little louder and we won't hear that battle cry, right? We won't even hear the shofar. But you know that shofar had to pierce their hearts. It had to. Therefore, because they would not go up, you realize that God was one of the first tribes to be dispersed and to be stripped of their inheritance in the Holy Land? Read it in the Chronicles. You don't want to fight? You'll be the first out because your hold is very tenuous. There's a river of separation between you and the congregation. You're part of them, but you're separate. It's only through your faith, correcting your priorities, and your obedience that where you are will remain a holy space. If you want to identify true shepherds of the sheep, you don't have to look to Israel and their politics to find a true shepherd of the sheep. You can start right here in this part of Israel. What you know, what you can discern. If you want to identify the true shepherds of the sheep, the true leaders, I want you to look to the last or the next congregational battle. You look at that conflict. Those who run away are the hirelings. The shepherd will lay down his life, his emotions, his pride. He will lay down everything for the sheep in order to stand with them. He will not allow that flock to scatter. In fact, he will lay himself down at the entrance of the sheepfold all through the night, all through the chaos and the confusion. He will lay himself right down there at the door and say, nothing's coming in here anymore. If you will stay in here, if you will stay inside this protective wall of the Torah, you will be safe. And I will give up my life before I allow the wolf to take yours. He will strip my pride before he strips yours. He will strip everything I have. He will come through me before he comes to you. He will lay down his life if necessary. The hireling leaves because he can't see any personal gain to it. The pasture's going to be greener on the other side when the conflict comes, right? If they lose their window of opportunity, if they have to give up something of their possessions, including their pride, all these other things we think make us rich, he will run back to the security of what he can control. Because let me tell you something, there's a lot of times when the shepherd doesn't feel like he's in control. He feels like he's getting run right over. But he will nevertheless stand in that evil day. The hireling will run away. Listen to Job 7:1. Truly man has a term of service, and in the Hebrew it means military service. Truly a man has a term of military service on earth. His days are like those of a hireling, like a slave who longs for evening shadows, like a hireling who waits for his wage. So have I been allotted months of futility. Nights of misery have been apportioned to me. When I lie down, I say, when shall I arise? But the night is long, and I am full of tossing until dawn. If you have a hireling's heart, you're just like this man that Job is talking about. You're punching the clock. You're watching the clock all day. Have you ever had a job you hated and you just watched that thing? Sometimes it went backward, you thought. You know how you hated being there? And you couldn't wait till you found another job? That's a hireling's heart. You will watch the clock like a wage earner. Is it 5 o'clock yet? You will simply endure being with this flock until you can get out here. What will you do? I've got a clock back here. You've got one on your wrist. Are we watching the clock because we want to get out of here and we're simply enduring being with these people? Or are we watching the clock because we know that there are opportune moments to find good grass? There are times of day when we need to stop and rest. There's times of day when we need a cool drink of water. So we discern those times. This is no place to get in a hurry. I used to feel sorry for you because our service was so long. I don't anymore. You know how long Rabbi Messer's services last? 5 hours. They dance for 2 hours. We're making no sacrifices here, okay? We're rich. If you're a clock watcher, if you just endure doing the things that you have to do in order to be a part of the flock, of the camp of Israel, then you're going to have nights of misery. I'm sorry. You won't be able to sleep at night. Why? Because you will be consumed with the thoughts of your own kingdom that you're trying to build. Forget your own kingdom. It's His kingdom. It's His flock. It's the greater flock. A shepherd will not only fight a wolf, he will build those fences, the Gedera of the Torah, to protect the sheep through the darkness and the chaos. He will lead you out to green pastures of good teaching. So the Holy Spirit will teach me. I don't need a shepherd. Then why did He put teachers in the congregations? Why is that a gift? You didn't need teachers? He will give you everything you need. He will give you spirits of prophecy, words of wisdom, words of knowledge, gifts of giving. Everything you need should be met right here. And if it's not, it's because we've still got the Spirit of God and Reuven striving within us. A good shepherd will lead you to a place of rest on Shabbat. And you know what? No matter how big the flock becomes, it's still his little flock. Because he's a poor man. And he understands that every lamb is precious. And every lamb needs to be selected without a blemish as it passes under the rod. Because the good shepherd will one day ask us to account for how we have treated this flock. And he's going to cause every sheep to pass under his rod. And he's going to say, why is this one lame? Well, I knew I was supposed to call them that week, and I just didn't. I didn't get around to it. Why does this lamb have a chunk missing out of its wool? Well, I gossiped a little. Maybe I should have gone and apologized. He is going to ask an account for how we have treated the sheep of this congregation. He's going to know if we have fought for them or if we have run away like a hireling. Every lamb is precious to a poor man. And this is the lesson of lay leadership for every person here. No matter who you are, you can either be a good shepherd or you can be a sinful shepherd. So choose today not to watch the clock, but to watch the flock. Choose to make their inheritance, their portion, as dear to you as your own. You know how badly they wanted that land? They had to want their brothers to inherit their portion as badly as they wanted their own, or it was not holy. It was not accepted. You can choose to make your dwelling place a holy space. I don't care how far you live from the river Yarden. By your obedience, adjusting your priorities, walking in faith before Adonai, you can make your dwelling place a holy space. Moshe and Yeshua taught you how. They went before you. Yeshua said, if you're not willing to leave your mother and your father behind for the kingdom, you're not fit. He's going to have to get you into shape. Does it mean you can't go? The first day of boot camp, a recruit doesn't look anything like the man coming out of boot camp at the end, does he? He will have to get you in shape. He will have to make you fit. And the place that he does that is with the congregation of Israel. Whether it's your small congregation or whether it's the greater flock. You have a great destiny. And so this is your boot camp. This is your training ground. If it hurts, it's supposed to. Any of you ever exercised and gotten into shape without hurting yourself? Aches, pains, sprains, bruises, crawling through the mud, all the things that go with boot camp. That's what this is for. If you feel like you're a little muddy some days, that was part of the plan. A true shepherd is not going to be out gadding about when the flock needs his attention, when he should be encouraging the camp instead of discouraging. You realize that's what it boiled down to? Moshe says in all these things we've gone through, what it boils down to is whether the people were encouraged to go forward or discouraged. All the trials and tests, encourage or discourage. Number one, you can encourage people by simply going with them, by being here, your presence. Go up with us. Number two, you can encourage the camp by the words of your mouth, by your deeds, because the weapons of our warfare are not bows and arrows or guns, right? They're spiritual weapons, and every one of you has at least one spiritual weapon on you at the moment. Now, maybe it's rusted out. I don't know. Maybe it misfires all the time. I don't know. Maybe you need to get the welding gear out. I don't know what it takes. But every one of you has a weapon of warfare in this camp. And it needs to be in here every Shabbat to encourage the rest of us.
Yes.
Your leaders work hard for you. Elder Robinson and Hermina, they work hard. Peter and June work hard. Gail and Kenny work hard. They sweat. Brother Ken and Brenda work hard. Alan works all the time. He works at home. You know, we can barely get our grass cut anymore. We work hard. And you're called to work just as hard as we do.
Amen.
Your sword might be bigger than ours if you take it out. Encourage us. Build those protective walls of the Torah around your families. Build the protective walls around your source of income. But how much do you really need? If you love Yeshua, if you love Yeshua, if you love Yeshua, feed his lambs. If every one of us were to give a fraction of the energy that we put into our jobs and that we put into our families, just a fraction. I know how hard I work 40 hours a week, so I can only imagine among all of us how much hard work and energy we put into our jobs. How much energy we put into our families, cooking meals, doing all the things that we do for our families. A fraction of that. If we brought it in here on Shabbat, the war's over. If one Shabbat we all got it together at the same time, there is no demon in hell that could stay in this place.
Hallelujah.
There is no wolf that could come through our gate. That's all I'm asking you for, is a fraction of what you put into your families and your careers in here on a day of rest. Do you have any idea the kind of warfare we could wage? If you will do this thing, if you will go up armed before the children of Israel, if you will do this thing, you will have your inheritance.